So, welcome everybody as we resume our Jews and the News. And what I wanted to talk about today, maybe next week we'll talk about rabbis for Kamala and whether that's appropriate for rabbis to come out publicly and state publicly that they need to support one candidate over the other. So maybe that'll be our topic next week. Today, I wanted to talk about the the growing rift in Israeli society between those who are advocating for Israel to do whatever it can to secure the release of the remaining hostages in Gaza, and those who firmly believe within Israeli society that Israel must do everything it can at all cost, even the cost of the lives of the hostages, to defeat and roundly defeat Hamas. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment and have us look at a recent article that Yossi Klein Halevi posted to Times of Israel as a blog, not as an article, but as a blog. And I don't read the blogs on Times of Israel. There are a ton of them, and anybody can apply to have their blog posted regularly on Times of Israel. But I do read Yossi Klein Halevi. I find him to be extremely intelligent, and I more often than not agree with his perspective on elements of Israeli society and Judaism as well. I've had the privilege of being able to hear him at and attend lectures and classes by him at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He's a senior fellow or on the faculty of after being a prominent journalist for English language press in Israel, and then wrote an author of very important books like Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor or something like that. Really, really important books. So he has something to say, and I think it's worth noting what he has to say about it. So let me just say before I share my screen that there are competing mitzvahs at stake. Okay, so this isn't just a moral ethical dilemma that I don't know, that an ethics class in college could study as a case study. You have a choice. I don't know, you got one person to save or 50 people to save. What do you do? Okay, and so it's this choice that you're left with. There's no right answer, or there's no good answer, or there's no moral answer. So do you protect Israel from its arch enemy, or do you save hostages, or do you save hostages? Okay, so pidyon shivuyim. That's what it's called in Hebrew. Like the dog tag that I'm wearing says bring them home now, but the Hebrew says halev shalanu, our heart. Lev is heart. Shalanu, our. Halev shalanu. Shavui, captive or hostage, is captive or hostage, be'aza, in Gaza. So pidyon is redemption, and shivuyim are captives or hostages, or captives or hostages. I was going to say prisoners, but prisoners could imply that they did something wrong. So it's captives or hostages. So it's an age-old mitzvah that Jewish communities tragically have been forced over the centuries, mainly in Europe, to fulfill. One rabbi, Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg, insisted when he was taken captive by church leaders in his town or the king, I don't remember exactly. He told his Jewish community at no under no circumstances are you to spend money to save me. And so he languished in jail for years until finally the authorities set him free. But so he was the exception of the rule that Jewish communities always raised and spent a lot of money to free leaders of the community who were taken hostage. So Pidyon Shvuyim, an essential mitzvah, highlighting the value of each and every Jewish life. So clearly, when over 250 hostages were taken by Hamas on October 7th, Israel's number one priority should have been and still should be to secure their release. However, and Israel tragically is forced by the monsters of Hamas to face this dilemma. Well, by releasing these hostages, by securing release of these hostages, we have to, like the terms for the release are release of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And of course, we know that in 2011, when Israel secured the release of Gilad Shalit, who was held hostage as an Israeli soldier in Gaza for years, they finally secured his release. One of the prisoners that Israel released was none other than Sinwar himself, and who is the monster who is coordinating everything for Hamas regarding October 7th and its aftermath. So there is potential dire consequence of reaching a deal to secure the hostages. But if you can weigh the potential risk, if you can ethically do so, like we're forced into facing this ethical and moral dilemma. That's just a further thing that the terrorists are doing to us. If you can weigh the risks, like what's more risky, have hostages die in Gaza, or have potential prisoners released who may return as terrorists and inflict more damage and death on Israel? You don't know. And then there's also if you secure the hostage release, which according to all the deals that have been in the works would mean a ceasefire, you're not utterly defeating Hamas. And then you're leaving yourself as the state of Israel open to almost 100% guarantee that there'll be more attacks by Hamas in the future. So it's clear, right, that there's no easy answer here. So let me share my screen, and then we'll open up for discussion. But I want to share my screen, and I want to read through Yossi Klein Halevi's article. He gets into politics at the end of it. I'm not sure we have to read that about Netanyahu and how much he despises Netanyahu and how much he thinks most of Israeli society today, most of the Israeli public despise Netanyahu. Not sure that we need to read that part of it, but let's read the beginning of this article. So what I did was cut and paste from the Times of Israel website so that we don't have to be distracted by ads on the side of the page or pop-up things or things like that. So just trust me that this is exactly how it appears in the Times of Israel. And if you want to read it in the original on the Times of Israel website, just go to the search on the Times of Israel website, put in Yossi Klein Halevi, and then you just scroll down a little bit and you'll see his blogs. So hold on one second. Shelley, Jerry is not in today. He's not in on Mondays and Tuesdays. Oh, okay. You need something from his office. Okay, I have to unlock it. Excuse me. Okay, sorry about that. I'm the only one here
Jonah,
besides. Yes, Bess.
I don't want a discussion, but I just think that it ought to be added to when you're weighing the
Uh-huh.
hostages versus the beating Hamas, that trying to protect the hostages possibly causes loss of life to the soldiers Israeli soldiers in Gaza, who are not using the obvious methods of throwing in a grenade into the tunnel before they go in. So I think.
Okay, so I think so that right. So knowing that there are hostages there impacts military strategy. Yes, absolutely, that's something to weigh. But I think that gets to the idea that right, that is an ethical and moral dilemma. Right, let's say intelligence is showing, or the information gathered through intelligence, that you have Sinwar in a tunnel, but he has hostages around him. Do you risk killing Sinwar at the same time killing hostages? So that's almost an untenable situation to have to face, right? Or also, do you risk terrorists escaping with the intelligence that might show that there are hostages in that tunnel, like you said, Bess, that would then prevent Israel from securing the death of those terrorists, right? So this is, we would imagine that armies of democratic countries would face the same kind of dilemma that Israel is facing. We would, and there is, it's just, there are so many tragedies as a result of October 7th. But one of the biggest tragedies is what Hamas has done to Israeli society, tearing it apart morally and ethically, forcing Israel to have to actually face these dilemmas that no one in their worst nightmare would want to face. So that not only did they actually physically kill 1,200 people, rape and torture scores of others, take hostage over 250. So the physical trauma that they brought to Israeli society is one thing, but the mental and emotional trauma that will last for decades is just unimaginable. So the fact that we're having this discussion is a result of Hamas's brutality and evil. And I think it's also important to have this discussion to keep in mind that we're not crazy. what I mean by that is the liberals in Western society will have us believe that Hamas is not at fault, that they are freedom fighters, and whatever they did, they needed to do in the process of securing the freedom of Palestinian self-determination. So that narrative, which is alive and well, and in America on the left, is really it just seems crazy to me. It just seems crazy because I just don't understand how people people who claim to be intelligent cannot see things for what they are. So I was invited by a former congregant, someone who's in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, who grew up at Sharei Tefillah. I officiated at his bar mitzvah. He, here, let me get it off my desk. Um, he co-authored a book called Safety Through Solidarity. So it's written by Shane Burley and Ben Lorber. So the Lorber family were members of Sharei Tefillah a long time, and Marion Lorber's parents were founding members, charter members of Sharei Tefillah, or almost charter members, the Eskins. Anyway, so out of the blue, he writes to me, say, I'm going to be at Busboys and Poets. I'm in Tacoma Park. I'm doing a book tour with my co-author. I mentioned Sharei Tefillah in the beginning of the book. This is a book about how the progressives and the left should be aware of anti-Semitism and should join forces to combat it. Okay, so I did a little bit of research about who Ben Lorber is and what he does, and so I went in with my eyes wide open, understanding that he's one of these people on the left promoting these ideas of Palestinian self-determination and that Israel is an apartheid state, that kind of thing. Okay, but still, I was willing to go, and I was leery about it. And so, he just in this talk, he just threw out phrases like Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. So, so it just boggles my mind, and I didn't stay. Well, I did stay for the Q&A, just one question, and that was more than enough for me to understand that it was. I compromised a lot for myself to attend this session. I didn't need to compromise anymore to hear the ridiculous questions and people pontificating. So anyway, I bought the book. It's important to hear what the other side has to say. And I also wrote an email to Ben afterwards saying it wasn't about you that I left. It was about the Q&A. And I have a question for you. And I'm happy to have a discussion in person if you don't want to do it over email. And my question was, why do you support Palestinian self-determination and not at the same time support Jewish self-determination? Israel claims to be a democratic state. That's what the Declaration of Independence of Israel states. Why can't you support Israel's right to exist? So,
Just a clarification,
yes, Laura.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Yeah, because I don't see, I think you could support both peoples, but I don't see why that has to mean Israel doesn't have the right to exist.
Right. So but it's, right. I could have been overreaching, right? But I have a sense, well, not necessarily from Ben Lorber, but from a lot of people on the left who are anti-Zionist, that their position is that there should be a state in the land of Israel, or what they would call Palestine, that would be made up of what should be a democratic state of the people of Palestine.
Right.
So
I understand where you're going.
which would mean that it would no longer be a Jewish state. It
Yeah,
would be
no,
a
I
Jewish
understand.
majority state. Okay, so that's
Yeah, yeah.
that's
Yeah,
the
I
anti.
would distinguish what I would think of
Theoretically,
more
we
as the
could make a
far left.
distinction. Laurie, theoretically, we can make a distinction. The
Uh-huh.
distinction is not made, from what I understand,
Oh,
of
I
people.
understand what you're saying. I think there are people who do make the distinction, but
They're few and far between, or they're not vocal enough.
okay,
Okay,
yeah, because I
I
totally support the Palestinians to
I'm not
self-determination.
suggesting that
Yeah,
that promoting the right of the Palestinians to have a state alongside Israel, that's not our discussion for today. But
yeah.
I do agree with that. Okay, but at the
Mhm.
same time, agree that Israel has a right to exist
Oh, totally, totally.
as a Jewish state, as a
Mhm,
Jewish democratic
mhm.
state.
Yeah,
Okay, and that there shouldn't be anything wrong to say that there is such a thing as a Jewish democratic state, just as
yeah.
there
No, I'm
shouldn't be,
totally with you on that.
just as
Yeah,
I'm just clarifying for other people too, that there shouldn't be anything wrong with saying there should be a Palestinian democratic state, if such a thing could be. Anyway, I'm a tangent and sorry about that, but it's so back to our moral dilemma of what to do about saving hostages. Do we save the hostages, or do we utterly defeat, if at all possible, Hamas? So this is what Yossi Klein Halevi said. Again, go to Times of Israel, or you can email me and I'll send you the link if that's easier, the direct link to this blog. When the immediacy of the horrors of October 7th begins to fade, right, let me make it a little bit bigger. Okay. When the
Thank you.
immediacy, yes. When the immediacy of the horrors of October 7th begins to fade, the trauma that will linger in the Israeli psyche is the shattering of two core assumptions about our country. All right, so many Jewish writers, especially in Israel, have this hope. The immediacy of the horrors of October 7th begin to fade. Well, they haven't begun to fade, but the hope is that it will someday. Okay, so I just want to say there's an optimism there that still exists, even in Israel, despite the horror that people are living through. Okay, so that but the trauma will linger about the shattering of two core assumptions about what Israel's all about. The first assumption was the belief that we know how to defend ourselves and project deterrence in a hostile region. Okay, so that's what Israel, since 1948, has had to do without choice to protect itself and ensure that it has the most sophisticated and advanced weaponry. Because if they didn't, and the Arabs had the more advanced weaponry, then Israel's existence would be at stake. Right. So since then, not only has Israel gotten sophisticated weaponry from the United States, and before that from France, and before that from Czechoslovakia, and also from Germany. Not that Israel also developed industry to make those the weaponry that they bought even more advanced themselves. Right? They took what they got, the fighter jets, and added more technology to it. They took the missiles and added more technology to that. So to be sure that we have the deterrence. But on October 7th, the weakest of our enemies delivered the most devastating blow in our history, sending a message of unprecedented vulnerability to our enemies. Okay? So in other words, if Hamas, this ragtag gang, not even wearing uniforms, ragtag gang flying motorized vehicles, paragliding motorized vehicles over the border, just taking jeeps and other vehicles to just ram through the border and be able to inflict such horrific damage. Wow. What does that say to anybody else who might want to consider, if Hamas can do it, we can do it too? The second core assumption about what Israel's all about was the belief that we know how to protect each other. So not only the assumption number one is that we can protect our borders and we are safe, but that we can protect each other. That, in other words, all people in Israel will be protected by the government, by the army. But on October 7th, the Israelis on the Gaza border were effectively abandoned by the army and the government, sending a message of unprecedented failure to ourselves, right? The people who took the chance to set up those kibbutzim, towns, cities, all around the Gaza Strip. It's just like in the pre-1948 years when pioneers, Zionist immigrants set up kibbutzim around Israel. They did so. Most of the kibbutzim to set up would be along the border, so that there would be people there who would be the first people to see if an enemy was coming across the border. Right. So these border villages, towns, kibbutzim, are set up around the Gaza Strip in order to provide Israel a way to, like a deterrence and a way to protect society. And here, Israel tragically and horrifically let them down. The ongoing agony of the hostages only deepens that sense of failure and shame. Israel's strength and resilience depend on maintaining our deterrence and our solidarity, the two pillars of our national ethos. During the first months of the war, Israelis pretended that we could do both: defeat Hamas, thereby restoring our deterrence, and free the hostages, restoring our faith in our ability to protect each other. Now, though, we know that we must choose between those two essential goals, right? That is, the now that he's talking about is that he wrote this last week after Hirsch, Goldberg, and five other hostages were found murdered by Hamas. So that adds to the immediacy. Their life is tenuous, and that Israel better do something, or else for sure the remaining hostages are going to die. That is the cruelty of our hostage dilemma. Prioritizing the hostages will have consequences for restoring our deterrence. In other words, save the hostages now, and as a result, Hamas is still alive as a terrorist organization. Or prioritizing victory will have consequences for restoring our solidarity. In other words, if we defeat Hamas at all costs, to every last terrorist, then we know for sure the hostages are going to be dead by the time that effort is done. So it's a no-win. It's a no-win. Proponents of either position need to acknowledge the brutal price their choice entails. The struggle between those two positions is playing out on Israel's streets through competing photographs of smiling faces. The posters advocating an immediate deal show snapshots of hostages in the poses of daily life, while posters advocating victory show snapshots of fallen soldiers in their youthful vigor. Right? So in other words, those protesting for the release of hostages are showing posters of hostages, bring them home now, and pictures of individual hostages, like when they were happy. And those who are protesting in favor of defeating Hamas fully are showing posters of soldiers who have died in Gaza after October 7th. Okay? The images pull on shared emotions, our concern for each other, but demand opposing political conclusions. Will you allow your sisters and brother to die in the tunnels, right? That's the hostage pictures. Or will you allow those who fought in the tunnels to have died in vain? The soldiers would have died in vain if we give up the fight now and leave Hamas alive, breathing, the ability to carry on while saving the hostages. This dichotomy promoted on the right, right? It's people on the right in Israel who are in favor of continuing the fight against Hamas, ignores the fact that many soldiers themselves say the motive inspiring them into battle is the rescue of the hostages. So they don't care if they die in vain as long as they've died trying to save the hostages, right? So the right ignores that element of what Israeli soldiers are fighting for, as opposed to what the right is promoting, according to Yossi Klein Halevi, that it's like almost like the Vietnam War for us. Our American forces come back and say, what was that all about? What did we just do? If we say we're trying to defeat communism, well, we fell far short of that. And then look at all the lives that we killed, and look at all the soldiers that died in vain, right? So, not quite like Vietnam and against communism, but it's this kind of suggestion on the right that maybe these soldiers, members of the IDF, will have died in vain if we leave Hamas alive and kicking. A poster held by relatives of IDF soldiers killed in Gaza at a protest in, oh no, I'm sorry. I should have deleted this because I deleted the pictures, but not the caption. Like most Israelis in the initial phase of the war, I prioritized military victory over rescue, even if I couldn't quite admit that to myself, right? At the beginning, October, November, you gotta get these monsters. Yes, and we'll get to the hostages, but first we gotta chase after Hamas. Yes, I think most people in Israel said that, and I probably, though the parents would not have wanted to admit it, but I bet most of the parents of the hostages would have agreed with Israel's goal at the beginning of the war. Understanding maybe Israel didn't know where the hostages were, but absolutely the parents of the hostages at the beginning would have mostly agreed that Israel needed to defeat Hamas. The overriding need in the immediate aftermath of October 7th was to prove that we could still defend ourselves. In media interviews and essays, I argued that our long-term existence depends on restoring our deterrence, and that could not be achieved by leaving a genocidal regime on our border, right? And that gets to the Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, totally ignoring the idea that Hamas's charter is the genocide of Israel, right? The utter destruction, defeat, and eradication of Israel off the map. And that's, okay. And I feared that the demonstrations to free the hostages might strengthen Hamas rejectionism in the negotiations, right? Right? If there are enough people arguing in Israel for the release of the hostages, then that only bolsters Hamas in its negotiations to say, if you really want these hostages released, well, you're going to have to pay the price. Today, though, I am on the streets demanding a deal. What's changed for me is the realization that allowing the hostages to die in captivity will also have fateful security consequences for Israel, perhaps even more devastating than not destroying Hamas. Okay, so for him, this is the consequence of not saving the hostages is worse than not destroying Hamas. If the hostages are left to die, large numbers of Israelis will believe they were sacrificed, the hostages were sacrificed, not for a higher security purpose like retaining the Philadelphia corridor on the border between Gaza and Egypt, but for the political needs of an endlessly cynical prime minister seeking to hold his coalition together. What matters for the well-being of Israel is not whether that perception is true, but that many Israelis are convinced that it is. The consequences for the covenant of trust between the state and a large part of its people will be far-reaching. Okay, so let me just reiterate this point. The idea is that Netanyahu is saying the future security of Israel relies on having a permanent presence in Gaza, on the border between Gaza and Egypt. That threatens the sovereignty of Egypt, because Egypt wants to be in charge of that border. But it just turns out that when they were in charge of that border, they allowed tunnels to be built and allowed arms to be smuggled from Egypt into Gaza through those tunnels, so that Egypt kind of turned a blind eye to what was going on by Hamas in Gaza. So if Israel does not have a presence on that corridor, then perhaps it goes back to, the situation will go back to what it was before, and that Egypt will allow Hamas to rearm, right? Arms coming from Iran, somehow getting into Egypt, and then getting into Gaza. Okay, that's the argument. However, then, as a citizen, who am I to believe? The heads of the IDF, the Mossad, the Shin Bet, all of whom insist that the Philadelphia corridor can be handled differently? In other words, they've come out and said in the past couple of weeks, Netanyahu's claim that we need Philadelphia is wrong. We don't need it in order to have ultimate security. There are ways around it, right? And they've already destroyed most of the tunnels, if not all of them, that lead from Gaza to Egypt in that corridor. And they've already secured the area. So is Netanyahu right? Or is the IDF, Mossad, and the Shin Bet right? So who am I to believe? The heads of the IDF, Mossad, Shin Bet, all of whom insist that a Philadelphia corridor can be handled differently, or a prime minister who repeatedly adds new demands in negotiations and who barely mentioned the corridor until recently, when far-right politicians threatened to bring down the government if he withdraws from there. Certainly, my faith in the wisdom and capabilities of our senior security officials has been badly shaken by October 7th, right? It's like with the Yom Kippur War, when Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan did not heed the warnings of the army then, right? Or maybe the army itself didn't heed certain intelligence that was coming across. And they just said it's impossible that Egypt and Syria could be planning something like that. So it took a long time for the IDF to rebuild trust among the Israelis that they know what they're doing and that they can protect Israel. That something like Yom Kippur wouldn't happen again. And then it happened again, and then we've already seen evidence about how there were warnings, and those warnings were not heeded. Okay, so there's still, Yossi Klein Halevi is arguing, there's still a sense of trust in the work of the army. Okay, for many Israelis, though, Netanyahu and his coalition of ultras, ultra-nationalist, ultra-Orthodox, ultra-corrupt, have lost all credibility. And as we say ironically in Hebrew, they've earned that mistrust b'yosher, fair and square. So in other words, they've earned that mistrust honestly. So that's just an Israeli way. Yeah, it's just Israeli humor to be ironic like that. Netanyahu has never conveyed to the nation a genuine sense of empathy with its anguish over the hostages. Instead, he and his ministers have sometimes communicated indifference to their fate and even contempt for their families. Netanyahu has scarcely met with the families over these long months. He has encouraged divisions among them, highlighting meetings with a handful of relatives of hostages who support him. Outrageously, the pro-government media has turned the families who are trying to pressure the government into prioritizing the hostages into virtual enemies of the state. The far right, which preaches love for one's fellow Jews, has shown little concern for the families. At Knesset committee sessions chaired by far-right members of Knesset, family members have been silenced, mocked, expelled. Some family members demonstrating against the government have been physically assaulted by its supporters with no rebuke from the prime minister. In a TV interview, a former hostage, Adina Moshe, recalled how she stood at an intersection holding a sign expressing solidarity with the remaining hostages. A passerby, recognizing her, shouted, "It's too bad they freed you." As she told the story on the news, she wept, not only, one sensed, from personal hurt, but from incredulity at the debasement of Israeli solidarity. All right, so then he goes on and on to talk about this sense of how Israeli society has been corrupted by the right and its positions and its opinions. So I wanted to share that article, and you can read the rest of it on the Times of Israel. But it is, like I said to start, Israeli society is beginning to fray. It was beginning to fray before October 7th, when every Saturday night since Netanyahu formed his coalition government almost 2 years ago, it'll be 2 years ago in December, every Saturday night since that December of 2022, yes, that Israelis have been on the streets about judicial reform, right? Protesting against the government's plan to reform how the Supreme Court of Israel and judges are chosen. Then it quickly changed after October 7th to support for the hostages. And now, this past Saturday night, reports claim that 500,000 Israelis were marching in the streets of Tel Aviv. That's like an incredible amount. That would be like, I don't know, let's say New York has 10 million people. That would mean 500,000. That would mean like 2 million people at least are marching in Times Square. Okay, like a quarter of the population of Tel Aviv. Are there maybe 2 million people? I don't know. Maybe it's 1 million people who live in the metropolitan Tel Aviv area, so it's half the size. So imagine 5 million people marching in Times Square about something. So it's just an incredible proportion of Israeli society protesting for the hostages. So, there's no answer. First thing is, we don't live in Israel. So we can say what we want and we can have our opinions, but until we live in Israel, I don't think we have the right to really demand something happen in Israel. The right of demanding only happens when you're living in the country as a citizen of that country. Number two is that the argument can be made that if Israel's security is at stake, then you could argue that you need to risk the lives of the hostages in order to maintain the security of the rest of the state of Israel. And even though it would be tragic for the hostages to die, if Israel remains secure, or Israel is able to rebuild its security and then its deterrence in the future, then it's a sacrifice that had to have happened. And you could argue that from a Jewish perspective, it is a tenable Jewish position to have. But at the same time, it's also a tenable position to have to save the hostages. So you can't win either way. So any questions, thoughts, or comments about
Yeah,
this?
I,
Yes,
I was
Bill.
wondering if you could say more about there were two different positions on the corridor, whether
So I, so
Netanyahu.
I, so I can't say more about that because I'm just not an expert on the
Okay,
security.
that's fine. I was just
So you'd
checking.
have to Google Israeli official positions about the Philadelphia corridor, and then you'd come up with the details about that and why the Army says that we don't need to have absolute control over the Philadelphia corridor.
Yeah,
still be able to,
'Cause that's a key fact.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on one second, that somebody's ringing at the front door. One sec. Okay, sorry about that. Luis got the door. Okay, Perry, you're
A
muted.
couple of comments.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Very early on in the session this morning, you said something about you're quite amazed that people who seem to be intelligent are saying the things that they're saying.
Yeah.
I find that really interesting because there's an editorial in the Post this morning
Oh,
basically asking the same question about people who support a certain political candidate.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I found that very interesting.
No,
The second thing I'd like to
yeah.
mention is an article that I saw in the last couple of days that it really just got me thinking. I'll take a position, but there's been an argument that Netanyahu is extending the war. In other words, not freeing the hostages so he doesn't get charged politically or excuse me,
Right.
not charged, but criminally. And
Yes.
I think that the article meant to say that, well, then why don't they go ahead and pardon him and then see what he does as an incentive to get the
Oh.
hostages released?
So again,
Interesting.
yes, it is interesting, and it's getting into muddy waters that I'm just not interested in going in terms of talking about politics in that way, and I just don't know enough about it. And
Yeah.
I'd rather focus on the issues themselves. Privately, I could give my opinion about Netanyahu, but I don't want to really do it here. I did enough about it by you can imply my position by the fact that I shared Yossi Klein Halevi's article and his criticism of Netanyahu. So enough said. Enough said about
But
it.
I did find
Yes.
some biases in that article that you went over this morning.
Well, yeah,
yeah.
of course. I understand that. He's totally biased against Netanyahu. And the only thing I will say is all of the polls that have been taken about if you were to vote for a prime minister today, who would you vote for? The vast majority would not vote for Netanyahu. Okay?
What I've seen other polls. I'm not saying
Yeah.
out of feeling, but I've
Right.
seen that the people are now going more right in Israel.
So, yeah. So again, society is near a breaking point in Israel, and it's tragic to see. And yes, Bess.
I did have comments. First of all, I would like to have seen or I can still look for a counter blog or a counter opinion piece to deal with the soft numbers of course, I'm getting a phone call at the same time. That he said many Israeli soldiers. Is that 20%, 48%, 65%? I would like a little bit more specific.
Right. So it's a blog. It's not an article. So he doesn't necessarily have to provide hard facts to back him up.
He's trying to be persuasive.
But just from just from my reading of Yossi Klein Halevi and being in classes with him, I trust him.
Okay. Also, I was disturbed by the hostage, the freed hostage, who was told you shouldn't have been freed.
You shouldn't have been freed, right?
Is she sure that was an Israeli and not an Arab? Who said it? 20% likelihood of it being an Arab. 20% of people.
So I can't say, Bess, about that. And I just
I can't imagine.
the point of that was not to try to defend the person in the car and to sweep it under the rug that maybe it was an Arab. The point of that was she heard it, and that it reflects this sense that look, Daniel Gordis every day writes Inside from Israel, right? And he wrote, before the Democratic National Convention, he shared something about Jonathan Hirsch Goldberg's father, Jonathan Polin. He wrote an op-ed in the main conservative, politically conservative paper in Israel called Makor Rishon. And he talks about how in his synagogue that there are people who are just not so supportive of bringing Hirsch home or any of the hostages home. And he talks about this sense of the split in society. So look for that. It's not just Yossi Klein Halevi talking about it. It's not just the one freed hostage talking about it. It's Jonathan Polin talking about it in his article too. It's clear. So it's clear to me from what I'm reading that Israeli society is split about this and split in a terrible way. It's just as society in general in the world today is, it's not open-minded, respectful disagreement. It's nasty, hurtful, painful disagreement.
That bothers me too. But okay, I want to just make a little sidebar here that as an American, this is not a political statement.
Yeah.
I am disturbed that 20 of the hostages were supposedly American citizens or are supposedly American citizens. And if 20 American hostages had been taken in France, non-Jewish hostages had been taken in another country, I think we would have heard a hue and upcry. We know that at least one of the 6 was murdered deliberately. And then that's on one hand, and a few weeks later or days later, an American protester in the West Bank who was acting aggressively and threateningly to the IDF was shot. Let's assume it was by an IDF soldier, which isn't yet proven. And there's a hue and outcry in every newspaper and radio station in America. That's one accidental death who was threatening.
I understand. So that's a political conversation and a bigger conversation for another time, just in terms of the bias, the anti-Israel bias that's out there. It continues to be head scratching, to say the least, as to how people can do that and not bother to try to understand the intricacies of the situation. So it's how the news, how the evidence plays out in the news, how it's reported, and why. So but I have no idea why that's the case. I know about the history of anti-Semitism in the world for the past 2,000 years, but I just don't, as I continue to be baffled by it. So, and it's terrible. Yeah, Bob, and then we'll close for today. What? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
There you go.
Why can't they hold, number one, do you think Netanyahu has an idea where the hostages are and elects not to go after them because it would destabilize himself?
I don't know if anybody's willing to go that far. I really don't. I think people are willing to go far to say that Netanyahu, it serves his advantage politically to have the war keep on going, because it avoids any kind of state inquiry into what happened, and it certainly it postpones any kind of trial or case against him going to trial. Okay, so that people are saying, but people haven't dared to say that he knows where the hostages are and he's intentionally ignoring to save them.
And why can't, basically, they've had elections. There's a period of time where they seem to have an election every other day.
Right, but there has to be enough people that the opposition can call a no confidence vote, but they have to have the votes to do it. And if everybody in Netanyahu's coalition still supports him, then even though he's hanging on by a thread, 61 seats, nobody has been willing to leave the coalition to vote against him. That's the
I
only
think-
way to bring down the government.
I think it's ironic that he claims to know best, and all the military people and the security people
Right.
know something else. Golly gee willikers, doesn't that sound familiar?
Of course. It's terrible. It's terrible. So yes.
But they knew what's best up before on October 6th. These are the same people.
Right.
So
Right.
let's
So this
question
is,
that.
so let me end with this thought that one of the classes I took this summer at Hartman was by somebody named Micha Goodman. And he's a noted thinker in Israel today, prolific author, academician, and he's a brilliant lecturer. And his take is that this is what he thinks needs to happen in Israeli society in order to make positive change. He said in the 1990s, Israel had a government that was all left. It was not a coalition of left and right or left and center. It was all left. That's the government that shook hands with Yasser Arafat, signed the Oslo Peace Accords. And it's the same government that then had to be in charge of Israel while the Intifada broke out. So Israel saw the danger of having a left government 30 years ago. Now Israel has a right government, only right? No coalition with center, certainly nobody on the left in the government at all. And what happens with a right government? October 7th. So he says the vast majority of Israelis are in the middle. There are extreme Israelis who are on the left, and there are extreme Israelis on the right, but the vast majority are in the middle. And what he's saying is that most Israelis don't know that they exist, that the middle exists, that the media reports in such a way to maintain this split in society, that media reports about how terrible the left is or how terrible the right is. The media does not report on the vast majority of Israelis who are in the middle. So he says, if only the middle could be aware of themselves and made aware of themselves and to become self-advocates, then that could be the way forward for Israel. I think we all know who that, he didn't say, but like Naftali Bennett is that guy who's supposed to be for the middle, but not to make it political. It's a fascinating kind of understanding of Israeli society, and that's the way it is. I think in all countries today, what the media likes to promote is the split, as opposed to the potential for compromise, or where more people agree. Right? It makes better news to have anger and protest and a right and wrong, left and right, than it is to have this alternative where there's a possibility to solve things. So that's just an interesting perspective from Micha Goodman, and something to keep in mind about all of this. But time has passed, and thank you for your attention. And we'll get to something tamer last week, talking about American politics and should rabbis be supporting Kamala Harris or Donald Trump.
I just want to say, I just looked up and the polls, you were right. The latest polls is anti-Bibi.
Yes. Okay. Have a good day, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.